we're now, as I say, we're going to go on till about 1:15 or so. So I'm going to allow speakers just actually speak and talk to you. I'm going to ask all our speakers to stay on time. We were a bit giddier this morning, okay? Because I want questions. I want to be at questions by not later than 1 o'clock. Okay, so the first speaker off is Elizabeth. Right, Elizabeth. You can all read about Elizabeth and listen to her now, please, for the next few minutes, and have plenty of questions for her. Okay, sure. At the end. No problem, Elizabeth.
Yep. Okay. I'd like to begin by thanking you so much, Jared, for extending this invitation to me. I am an alumni of the Center for Disability Law and Policy, so it's always so great to come back to Galway. The summer school is special for all the learning and the sharing that happens. So I'm really looking forward to, learning and sharing together this morning. So my presentation today is about looking beyond the developed world and looking at the disability advocacy challenges that exist in developing countries. I think the morning session really set such a good foundation for my presentation, because as I listened to Senator Tom and the rest of the panelists speak, I kept thinking that actually, as they described the process towards getting the ADA, the challenges that they faced are a lot of the similar challenges that we are facing in developing countries. So it was really interesting to hear and kind of think it's not so different after all. Like the challenges of discrimination and all other issues that people with disabilities face are quite common across the globe, and we'll see this. So just to summarize the challenges that I'll speak about today in a nutshell, I'll speak about the context of poverty and limited resources, the organizational and advocacy capacity of DPOs, the question of whether participation is tokenistic or actually effective, and the low priority that disability often tends to be given in the national agenda of developing countries. We'll look at the negative attitude, stigma, and discrimination that exist against people with disabilities. We'll also discuss inaccessibility as a key barrier, as a key advocacy challenge that civil society has to face in developing countries. And we'll also look at the limited availability of reliable data. And I just wanted to say up front that, of course, the advocacy challenges are so different in the different countries, because the developing world, even as we call it that, is the countries are so different in context. Africa, Asia, Latin America, there are such stark differences between the countries. And so this will probably come across as a broad sketch of the challenges rather than being very specific to each country or to each context. So just to highlight that. So from the World Report on Disability of 2011, we know that about 15% of the world's population are people with disabilities, of whom the majority live in developing countries, because this is where the majority of the people in the world live. So in this regard, then, I think that a really important point to make is that regardless of the many differences that face the developing countries, we have one thing in common, largely, that we have ratified the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities quite broadly. Yes, so if you if you take a look with me, so the countries that are shaded a darker blue are countries that have ratified the convention. The lighter blue countries are signatories, and the orange-ish have taken no action on the convention, right? So if you take a look at Africa, you see nearly all the countries have ratified the convention. Only very few have taken no action. So Botswana there, Somalia, South Sudan, just really few countries haven't actually ratified the convention. And it's the same. And it's the same if you look at like most of Asia and if you look at most of Latin America. Basically, the governments of most of the developing countries have signed on to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So it's a really good starting point for disability rights advocates, basically. So regardless of this then, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges. Going into the challenges then, I think the biggest challenge is the context of poverty and the context of limited resources. In a research done by the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa in 2012 that looked at the status of people with disabilities in 9 African countries, including Angola, Botswana, Malawi, Mozambique, and several other countries. I'd like to read this quote because I think it so powerfully describes what a challenge limited resources are to disability rights advocacy. So the report states that the situation in Africa differs radically from that in the US or Europe for a number of reasons. Most fundamental is the issue of poverty. Severe poverty disempowers people and severely limits the extent to which people can organize themselves into successful DPOs. More pressing still than the disempowerment of poverty is the difficulty of survival. For example, though a person with a spinal cord injury in a wealthier country or even in South Africa has a long life expectancy, some have estimated the life expectancy for a person with a spinal cord injury in a poorer African country at between 4 months and 2 years. So when people are concerned with issues of survival, when people are concerned with issues of where the next meal is coming from, it's really difficult to get them together, to organize and to fight for rights, say, to begin to fight for equal access to justice when you're worried about your next meal. So, sorry. So I mean, and given the fact that in a lot of countries in the developing world, state provision, so state benefits for people with disabilities are so limited. Many people with disabilities are unemployed. Many people with disabilities live in contexts of dependency in their families. In such circumstances, it's really difficult for people to get together and advocate for rights. So I think this is the first critically important challenge to disability rights advocacy in developing countries. More on the context of poverty and specifically on DPOs now. So disabled people's organizations in the developing world often have inadequate funding. Not many donor organizations fund disability, and there's very limited, and not all states fund disabled people's organizations as well. So many DPOs are struggling for resources in the first place. Like, that's a real challenge. Making it very difficult, of course, again, to organize and advocate for whatever issues they might need to advocate for. And there's an additional issue as well with regard to the governments themselves and the capacity that the governments have in terms of just technical capacity, financial capacity, and human resource in government. I remember doing a research sometime in 2012 and interviewing state officials in Kenya, which is where I come from. And I was interviewing them about a cash transfer program that had just begun. And one of the things the state officials said was that they have great difficulty just deciding on the criteria of people to award these cash transfers to. Just kind of getting down to that basic level of whom shall we make eligible for these cash transfers, because the resources are so limited in the first place, and how do we go about categorizing who gets it and who doesn't? So real challenges there in terms of finances and in terms of technical capacity of the governments themselves. And we see this issue of capacity repeated over and over again by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to Developing Countries. So for example, in the just issued concluding observations to Thailand, the committee expressed concern at the Department for the Empowerment of Persons with Disabilities, which lacks sufficient capacity and resources to fulfill its mandate. So this expression of concern is a common theme in the concluding observations to developing countries. So moving on then to the other challenge of organizational and advocacy capacity of DPOs, we know that historically people with disabilities have been marginalized and that many of them have not had access to education. So how this then impacts advocacy, for example, is at the very basic level of writing project proposals. Writing project proposals in order to attract funds, in order to be able to advocate or to do other things. Reporting financial arrangements within the DPO, just at the very basic level of how to basically organize. And if you figure what law reform processes tend to be like, you can see how difficult it might be to engage with such processes if the majority of the people, of your members, didn't have access to an education in the first place. So this is a real challenge, particularly for rural-based DPOs in the developing world. There's also limited coordination and partnerships among DPOs and between DPOs and other civil society organizations. And this resonated. The morning presentation again, where it came up that the different groups of people with disabilities, that one of the greatest challenges was uniting them to get like a unified voice to speak together. I find that very often when if a person, so for example, if you have a meeting and there's no representation from an organization of people with intellectual disabilities, their issue won't be raised. It's very difficult for other DPOs to articulate clearly what the issues are for people with disabilities from a different disability, for people having a different kind of disability. So it's these kind of issues that are a real challenge. And finally, on this issue of organizational capacity of DPOs then, this is from the Disability Rights Fund Learning Evaluation Report, where they highlight that advocacy that is based on human rights is a relatively new area of work for many DPOs. And this then means that many DPOs are themselves just now catching up on the human rights angle of advocacy. For a long time, it's been about providing services and just struggling to start up, struggling to survive. So now getting to this new level of engaging with policymakers is quite a challenge for many DPOs in the developing world. The other question is one of whether participation is tokenistic or whether it's actually effective participation. And again, I'll go back to that report by the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, because I think they articulated this issue quite well, where they said that the biggest challenge for DPOs appears to be persuading governments to take the crucial steps from discussion and consultation to policymaking and legislating, and then to actually ensuring that the promised services take concrete form. And I think there's a paper by Bertha McDonald, who did a research in Zambia and found and talked about this difference between active participation and effective participation. So DPOs will be called to meetings by the state talking about, say, the mental health law. So you will attend as DPOs and you will give your views and you will talk passionately, but the end result does not take into account your contribution. So yes, you participated, that you were in the room and you spoke, but the final result does not actually reflect what it is that you contributed. So then you find DPOs getting quite frustrated, and this is a challenge that comes up again and again and again in the developing world. There's also the question of where disability is placed as a priority in the national agenda. So this is particularly so in situations where countries have experienced prolonged periods of internal violence, political upheavals, and wars. And just getting disability on the policy agenda is so difficult when the country is just trying, to rebuild itself after sort of difficult periods. I attended a meeting with a colleague from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he expressed how, the difficulties that they're having there as DPOs approaching government on disability issues, because the government is saying, well, look, we basically hardly have infrastructure, we hardly have education for anyone, let alone people with disabilities. So it's a real challenge in circumstances where nearly everyone is living on the borderline, on the margins, to really bring this issue of disability on the agenda and to be able to justify it, especially since disability is very often seen as a specialist field that requires a lot of resources, which, we saw that it's not necessarily always true, but it's perceived that way. And I think many developing countries are also grappling with many other challenges, tackling violence and crime, building basic infrastructure, addressing, unemployment, hunger, like basic nutrition. It seems sometimes that the challenges are so many and that it's a real fight to say why, to justify why disability. So the other issue then that I'd like to raise is the issue of negative attitude, stigma, and discrimination against persons with disabilities as a real challenge, as a real barrier to advocacy. And this is an issue across the world, including in developing countries. So sometimes it's religious beliefs or cultural traditions that affect attitudes towards people with disabilities. And again, if you look at concluding observations of the CRPD committee to many of the developing countries that have come before the committee, on Article 8 on awareness raising, this concluding observation, like this one to El Salvador, keeps coming up, that the committee is concerned at the lack of national awareness raising campaigns designed to combat negative stereotypes of persons with disabilities. So this comes up over and over again. And the problem with negative attitudes then is often that they often lead to discrimination in law and policy. For example, in 2014, Kenya passed a marriage act that forbids persons of unsound mind from marrying. So then you move from a situation where it's kind of being excluded at the local level to a situation where the laws begin to reflect those discriminatory attitudes. And this is a real challenge in the developing world. 2 minutes, okay? So the other issue then is an issue of inaccessibility. And just to say that in a lot of the developing countries, access is still such a challenge in the first place. Like the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights monitored the rights of people with disabilities in Kenya, and they said that most of the buildings sampled were inaccessible and could not accommodate a person on a wheelchair. On transportation, it was completely, public transportation in Kenya and in many of the developing countries is completely inaccessible to persons with disabilities. So even before talking about other issues, just getting to the meeting in order to advocate for your rights is a real challenge in the developing world. Of course, data is also a problem and this is, again, something that the committee keeps saying to developing countries to collect data in order to enable them to implement the convention. So I'll end with a slide from the first African woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, Wangari Maathai, who was from my home country, Kenya, and she said that human rights are not things that are put on the table for people to enjoy. These are things that you fight for and then you protect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, well, you saw the little contrast there from our earlier morning, where poverty plays a big, huge part. Also the lack of organisation, and indeed where DPOs don't even have the influence to be able to draw on money or philanthropy and support, etc. So we have a big challenge there. And then finally, we had all of the expectation of databases and all of the other things that's been put on people in order to comply with UNCRPD. Thank you very much again for that, Elizabeth. Now we'll move over to, it's not Barbara, let's show him. Catherine, no, not Catherine, sorry. My fault, it's, You know who you are. Hi, Karen, yeah. Okay, I knew she knew who she was. Sorry about that, Karen.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Oh, they're going to sleep on us.
Thank you. I particularly appreciated Elizabeth's presentation. I come from South Africa, also a developing country, and those issues are very real. But I stand before you today with a different hat, and that is the hat of the head of human rights at the Commonwealth Secretariat. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share some perspectives with you, and I wish to congratulate the Centre, and specifically Gerard Quinn, with whom we have a long-standing relationship, for the commitment and steadfastness in raising the bar on disability rights promotion and protection. I will be focusing on national human rights institutions and their roles in regard to advocacy and change. I was very pleased to see that tomorrow afternoon there's a segment that has been dedicated specifically to NHRIs and their relationship with civil society. Now, the Commonwealth is a voluntary association of 53 independent and equal sovereign states. It is home to 2.2 billion citizens, about 30% of the world's population, and about 60% are under the age of 30. We have a Commonwealth Charter which specifically underlines that we are implacably opposed to all forms of discrimination, whether rooted in gender, race, color, creed, political belief, or other grounds. 43 of our member states have ratified the convention. And we are not satisfied, although this is a good trend and it has improved over the past few years. We aim to ensure full Commonwealth ratification. Over a number of years, we have worked to establish and strengthen national human rights institutions in order to improve their capacities and effectiveness on the basis that they are a key element of a national protection system, human rights protection system, with broad responsibility for the promotion and protection of human rights. They ought to be an important bridge within society, linking government, parliament, various other state entities, academic and research centers, civil society organizations, and the international, regional, and national human rights protection systems. This remit is underscored by the fact that there are a set of international principles which are called the Paris Principles, which is the gold standard for their operation. There is an accreditation process under which The NHRI is assessed according to these principles, and if they are found fully compliant, they are graded A. And these institutions are the subject of resolutions in the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. And so their importance has been recognized, and the fact that they have a critical role to play. Independent and effective NHRIs can play an important role in, amongst other things, upholding and reinforcing the rule of law, good governance, and the effective administration of justice, combating discrimination and advocating for the protection of minorities, indigenous populations, and vulnerable groups, facilitating legal and institutional reform and the improvement of security institutions such as the police and prisons administration, and monitoring places of deprivation of liberty. And in all of these 4 pillars, you can clearly see that disability plays a clear role. In many countries, persons with disabilities are still locked up, removed from society and locked up, and so human rights institutions have a key role also in the last pillar that I mentioned, in being able to enter these places that deprive persons of their liberty, to monitor what is happening there. They are also equally positioned to provide the UN and intergovernmental organizations such as ours with independent, authoritative, and evidence-based information on national situations, and can in turn promote implementation of UN norms and standards in country. They can also promote new approaches to indicators and data collection. And in a number of countries, which Elizabeth was talking about, we have a paucity of data. For instance, encouraging their disaggregation so as to expose possible grounds for discrimination prohibited under international law. Now, I want to emphasize what I've said about NHRIs with 2 specific examples. In 2012, a wheelchair user, Doug Pauly, was told by a bus driver that he could not get onto a bus to Leeds because a mother with a baby, asleep in a pushchair, refused to move from the disability space on the bus. At the time, the bus operator merely needed to request the person to move and could do nothing. The bus driver could do nothing if the person refused to move. So it wasn't compulsory to ensure that the person moved and vacated the space, the wheelchair space. In this case, he was not allowed to get onto the bus because the woman, the mother with the baby, refused to move. He held that the policy of the bus company was discriminatory, but the bus company held that it was the most feasible that could be employed. He went to court and he won the initial case against the bus company, in which the court declared the policy of requesting and not requiring able-bodied passengers to move to be unlawful disability discrimination. But the judgment was reversed by the Court of Appeal in 2014, which ruled that although wheelchair users have priority to occupy the wheelchair space, there is no legal requirement for bus drivers to move other passengers from it. Mr. Pauly has now appealed to the Supreme Court, so this has been coming on since 2012, and still there is no resolution. And he was a single person initially. So he has now appealed to the Supreme Court with the support of the Equality and Human Rights Commission of the UK, and this makes all the difference. And they have been supporting him not only financially, but in terms of technical assistance as well. The Commission has set out the details of this case specifically on its website, and on Wednesday last week, the chair of the Commission said the following publicly. This is not about pushchairs versus wheelchairs, but confusing policies from bus companies that cause problems. Bus companies have a duty to allow wheelchair users to travel, given how vital this is to disabled people being able to live independent lives. And so this case continues. There's also much value in a human rights commission being able to put information before a court, because a court of law is not necessarily an expert in such a technical field. And so this is also one space in which NHRIs can be particularly of relevance and innovative. Another example I share with you comes from the South African Human Rights Commission. It's a different example. They developed a monitoring framework to enable them to assess the progress that employers are making in the recruitment, retention, and accommodation of persons with disabilities in the workplace. This document or toolkit sets out the indicators to be monitored in the implementation and the questions to be asked to obtain the necessary information. It could be used by an employer, by public authorities, and other interested stakeholders as a self-assessment tool, and it is also used by the Commission to monitor implementation of Article 33 to enable businesses to comply with the various national and international obligations. Now, both the Equalities Commission of the UK as well as the South African Commission are members of the Commonwealth Forum of National Human Rights Institutions. And this network of practice, of which we, the Secretariat, are the coordinator, is the main platform through which we use to promote good practices that are being developed and implemented by NHRIs, including in the field of disability rights practice. It has its own website through which these practices are being shared, and annual meetings which become another vehicle through which to share innovation. Now, in concluding, and before the chair says to me I have 1 minute left, and since I will not be here, colleagues, for the rest of the week, I would like to share with you some action points which I am asking you to consider in the course of impacting change looking forward. I also do so because I always think that when we attend and participate in these kinds of meetings, I think we have the responsibility to reflect on how we are going to use new information that was acquired, new learnings that we've adopted in our spheres of influence, and to impact change when we get home by doing things a little differently. Firstly, I talk about the relationship between civil society and a national human rights institution. Do you know whether there is a relationship? If not, why not? And how much do you know about the National Human Rights Institution in your country and its disability rights promotion and protection program? Have you made any efforts to share your work with the National Human Rights Institution? So put yourself up front in their faces and make yourself known in terms of the work that you are doing. The relationship, the second one, the relationship between Parliament and the National Human Rights Institution in your countries. There is a global move, and there are resolutions that come from the Human Rights Council as well on the role of parliaments in the work of the Council, and specifically under the Universal Periodic Review. In terms of analysis that has been done about recommendations that are made under the Universal Periodic Review, it has been found that 60 to 70% of those resolutions require new legislation or review of legislation or harmonization of existing pieces of legislation. And so parliamentarians have a critical role to play in all of this. And so the question is also, is there a relationship between Parliament and the National Human Rights Institution? And if not, why not? There ought to be this working relationship between these two institutions, and there are a number of forms of cooperation which could be encouraged. Establishing a formal framework to discuss issues of common interest and exchange of information relevant to the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities, for example. Secondly, parliamentarians seeking expert advice from the NHRI on disability rights. Also, NHRIs making recommendations to Parliament on a specific piece of legislation which is not aligned to international obligations. then I'm also saying that relevant parliamentary committees or caucuses, and they could be ones on human rights or for the justice sector, should work on the basis that Parliament has the obligation to protect and actualize human rights. One way in which they ought to be doing this is to hold national institutions, such as the National Human Rights Commission, to account. And the questions they ought to be asking, for example, are around how the Commission has expended its budget. Does it collect disaggregated data which references discrimination on the grounds of disability, for example? And what has it done to promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities? The last point I make is, how does the National Human Rights Institution and civil society leverage their resources and expertise to take forward innovative advocacy and interventions, especially bearing in mind the challenges which my colleague Elizabeth also referred to in her presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
There you are, Karen McKenzie, Head of Human Rights in the UK and the Commonwealth. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to our final speaker very quickly, for this session at least, Marian Harkin, MEP. Not sure what she's a real cousin or not, or just an Irish cousin of the Senator, but we'll find out more later.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and good morning, or is it afternoon at this stage? I think it's just about afternoon.
Yeah.
I'm sort of an interloper here. I sort of snuck in and sat at the back for a while, and then because, unfortunately, Martin Naughton can't be with you today, I was asked if I might say a few words on the issue that Catherine was going to speak to you about, which is the process at European level. Let me say I know Catherine very well. I meet her on a regular basis in the Parliament because Catherine is the CEO of the European Disability Forum. She's very much a hands-on person and participates in everything that affects disability in the Parliament, and I'm honoured to be her stand-in this morning. Of course, I know Gerard Quinn very well also. I've been honoured to host Gerard on a number of occasions in the Parliament when he launched his European Yearbook on disability law, which is a superb series of documents looking at EU disability law. Gerard is a superb advocate for disability, and I think this morning's conference, and indeed all of the work he has done, is a testament to that. And as to my cousin in the audience, he says, at least we're kissing cousins. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm very happy that he claims that I'm his cousin, because Tom Harkin has been a trailblazer in the US. And what I just find so great is not, that somebody will do something like the ADA, but he's not resting on his laurels. He's no longer a senator, but what is he doing? December of this year, he's ensuring the conference that's going to take place in Washington, which is going to look at the issue of employment for people with disability, and he will have employers there, look at best practice, etc. So that's pushing the barriers even further, and that's what you absolutely have to keep doing. So, and then of course we have our chairman here, Mr. Naughton, who has, let me assure you, challenged. Tom told the story of what happened, people who literally crawled up the steps outside Congress or the Senate or wherever it was, I'm not sure. But I can remember a sit-in in the European Parliament being led by none other than the chairman here. And he was determined that a number of MEPs came to listen to the presentation that was being made. But as far as he was concerned, and he was right, not enough MEPs came. I have to say, I arrived at the beginning and I was too afraid to leave until the whole thing was over. But, and he challenged people, and you absolutely need to do that. But anyway, just for a few minutes to let you know what's happening at European level and what has happened since the EU acceded to the UN Convention. It's the first human rights treaty that the EU has ratified, and there are 3 countries that still, including Ireland, the Netherlands and Finland, that have to ratify, and all of them are making good progress towards ratifying, but the EU itself has ratified the UN Convention. So I suppose the question is, what does that mean? Well, the EU submitted, the European Commission submitted its initial report, I think, in 2014, and then we had a response in 2015, and we had the final conclusions from the UN in, I think it was August of last year. So, as I said, the question is, what are we doing at EU level? And just before I go to that, I suppose my own background is that I'm Vice President of the Disability Intergroup in the Parliament. It's the biggest and the oldest intergroup in the Parliament, and I was last term as well. And my committee, my main committee, on which I'm coordinator for my group, is the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, and we are the lead committee on the UN CRPD. And indeed, we have just completed a report by Helga Stevens on the ratification of the UN CRPD and what that means for the Parliament, the Commission and the various European institutions. And I was glad to be shadow on that, which means I led for my group on that particular report. But, as I said, we had the concluding observations, and as soon as we had those, at the end of last year, we organised a large conference in the Parliament to look at those concluding observations, and indeed Catherine Naughton was one of the people who spoke at that conference. We also had the European Ombudsman at the conference because part of her role, obviously, is to look at the European institutions and the work they do. She happens to be an Irish woman, Emily O'Reilly, and she was also very much part of the conference. But perhaps the most crucial thing I can say is that one of the things we really are trying to take on board, especially since last September, since we've started this process, is that we ensure what we call structured dialogue with organisations that represent people with disability. And they also had a significant input into that conference. And following on from that, we decided in our committee to put forward what's known as an own initiative report. And what that means in simple language is this will be the opinion of the Parliament on the concluding observations. It is not a legislative document, but it certainly carries a lot of weight, and we hope and believe it will be the template within which the Parliament will work in all its different committees over the next number of years, looking at EU legislation, making sure it complies with the CRPD, etc. So, just a few items that are in this report, just to let you know some of the detail. First of all, the issue of reasonable accommodation. And one of the problems we face is that we have something called an Employment Equality Directive, but that does not make the absence of reasonable accommodation a form of discrimination, where of course the CRPD does. So one of the things we're going to have to do is look at that directive again and amend or change that so that it's in conformity, in compliance with the CRPD. Another piece of legislation that we have transposed recently is the Cross-Border Healthcare Directive, which actually allows a citizen, any citizen from an EU country, to go to another EU country for a medical procedure, shall we say, provided that procedure is available in their own member state and provided it doesn't cost any more in the member state to which they're going, because obviously we have to be careful of what you might call medical tourism. But one of the issues about that particular piece of legislation is that it doesn't specifically prohibit discrimination on the grounds of disability. And given that that piece of legislation may be used by people with disabilities, I'm sure will be, and maybe even more frequently than in the general population, we need to go back and look at that also. As I said, structured dialogue is very much part of what we're doing. All of our meetings in the Employment Committee, when we were discussing the report, were all fully accessible, and that's the first time that has happened in the European Parliament. What we now have to do is ensure that it continues. One of the concluding observations from the UNC RPD committee was that we need to mainstream the disability perspective into all gender legislation, and equally that we need to mainstream gender perspective into all disability legislation. But perhaps the most important one is that we need to mainstream disability perspective into all legislation, all our policies and all our strategies. And as I said, the report that the Parliament has, we have now voted it through our committee. It will go to the plenary session, the entire Parliament, in September, and I expect will be voted through pretty much as it is, and that again will be the template within which we will work. One or two other issues before I finish, because it's important to leave time for people to make comments or to ask questions. We need to look at our public procurement legislation, to look at the whole area of social obligations under public procurement. We have a proposal from the Commission on an EU Accessibility Act, which is at the moment going through the legislative process. For those of you who don't know how it works, in one sentence, the Commission proposes the legislation, the Parliament then amends or changes the legislation, and finally we then have to agree with the Council of Ministers on the final shape of the legislation. And until there is agreement between all three partners, but mainly the Parliament and the Council which represents the Member States, we have no legislation. So we are in the process at the moment of looking at the Accessibility Act and amending that to make it a better proposal than what the Commission has come forward with. And just very briefly, to give you some idea of how we as individual MEPs can work and make a difference, we have just passed some time back the Access to Public Websites Directive. Now, I was working on that in my committee, I was shadowing for it. I don't know anything about building public websites. I don't have a disability. So how could I meaningfully contribute to that piece of legislation? So what I did was I contacted the Disability Federation here in Ireland. They supplied the experts. I brought them out to Brussels. I went to meetings, and they came forward with the amendments and the proposals to make it a better piece of legislation, which I then submitted, and actually, virtually all of them got through and are in the final piece of legislation. So that's how, as an individual politician, you can make a difference and reflect the needs and the views of the sector without being in any way an expert yourself. Finally, just before I finish, I spoke to Jared briefly about what's happening, and he said about the Commission that they said that really this is only for current legislation, and you mentioned that the structural funds legislation was open at that time, and because it was, you were able to get really good outcomes. Jared knows more about this than I do, but there are many other funds that, for example, like the Juncker Investment Fund and other funds that are there at the moment, and the same has not been done. So we have a body of work to do to look at that. Some of those funds, Jared told me, are not inclusive. So, as I said, some of this seems a little bit dry, but at the end of the day, it's one thing to say you have a right. It's a very different thing to be able to exercise those rights. And until the legislation is right, you can't do that. So if you like, that's the work we do in the Parliament. So I'm just going to finish off by saying that one of the things I do on a regular basis is I go around to schools and I talk to students about the EU and what's happening, etc. And one of the things I often say to them is that life is not a dress rehearsal. The only day that any of us have, any of us in this room, is today. There's no guarantee of tomorrow. So that's why we have to keep challenging and keep working and keep pushing to make a positive difference. And all I can tell you is that one of the first people to teach me that lesson was the chairman here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, better explain why we were confined to the rooms of the Parliament at one stage. For the last number of years now in the European Network of Independent Living, we deliberately do a freedom drive to Europe. So from different countries right across Europe. And the purpose of it has many purposes. It's to draw attention and to bring the lived experience right into the heart of the Parliament and to remind them that there's more of us coming every year and we're not going to go away. So we do that, and we had a bit of a disappointment one of the occasions that not enough MEPs turned up. We had done this huge journey, etc., and they felt they knew more about us than we did. So we let them know how much we knew about them. So listen, thank you very much to all the speakers, and thank you particularly there to Noreen, Marian. I would now turn over to the audience. I have to get at least 6 or 8 questions in, because if I don't get 6 or 8 questions in, I can't collect my fee. Right? Maybe that was a different organization, I don't know. Anyway, will you do the best you can? And please help me by addressing the question to the person you want to answer, because I'm not going to have everybody answer the same question. So please, first name up. Oh, up there at the very back. That's first, and I'm looking for the next person here, this gentleman here, and the lady here, right? So, at the back.
All right, thank you so much. All right, thanks. The question that I want to ask, or a point that I want to discuss, is in relation to the CRPD itself. The first presenter gave an overview of the countries that have ratified so far, and it was really encouraging that in Africa, almost every country has ratified except a few, 2 or 3 that haven't, and it's a good starting point, even though the issue of implementation, we still have a long way to go. Now, the issue that I wanted to bring to the attention of this meeting is to do with what is happening in Malawi. Some of you, Malawi, that's in Southern Africa, or one of the countries in Southern Africa. Some of you might have heard about the killings of persons with albinism, which is happening in Malawi. It's one of the most serious violations of human rights in the history of disability rights in Africa and the world over. From day to day, persons with albinism are being killed, are being abducted. It's a huge concern. Surprisingly, we are not really hearing anything from the international community. And in the CRPD, we have Article 32 that really speaks about international cooperation, the need for the international community to come together, the international DPOs.
I'm going to ask you to leave it there, and I'm going to come back to Elizabeth or Karen for an answer in a little while, or for a comment, at least.
But I have 2 more questions.
Oh my God! All right.
You're going to get paid more.
Yeah. You going?
Yeah, and another one is also related to her presentation about the DPO's capacity. I work for an organization that works in 10 countries in Southern Africa, and recently we had a research to do with capacity building of DPOs. And I had the opportunity to conduct a series of focus group discussions in Lesotho, South Africa, and Botswana. And there was the issue of the donors, maybe not interested to fund disability projects. But one of the issues that came out of the discussions that we had was that when the call for proposals come out, because the majority of persons with disabilities, they have low, education, they are not able to really understand the call, to comprehend, because it's too technical. And one of the recommendations, the calls tend to be too technical. So one of the recommendations that came out was that, institutions like EU, most of the times, because the calls are so technical, why do they use the one-size-fits-all? Maybe it's time for such funding organizations to take into consideration the situations on the ground, especially with the DPOs who fail to apply for funding opportunities, not because they don't have good ideas, but because they just cannot apply for such opportunities. So this is something that maybe we also need to think about in these sessions. And then finally,
No, I'm going to have to hold you there now because
All right.
there'll be other people, right?
all right, thanks.
Can I go to the second question, please, sir?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Gabriel from Ethiopia, and my question goes to the first presenter, Elisa. You said you mentioned poverty as a major challenge to the implementation of the Convention and disability rights, and at home, mainly in developing country. That is where my problem is. In Africa, or like in my country, for example, we have these airlines, we have this telecommunication, we have these big government offices who have enough money to make little change. And we have also star hotels, we have a number of big enterprises. They just need only little costs, as of course I also draw analysis from Senator Harkin, who was also saying the cost is always exaggerated. Like he mentioned the school, and that's what happens in many places in Africa. There is a fear of cost, which is completely, in some cases, false. So is really poverty a problem to the implementation of what you call this convention? Or are we making use of this as an excuse to our inaction to comply with the convention? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to go on to just 1 second, we have the third question. Who was it? Oh, yourself. Huh? Okay. No, I have the third questioner for the moment. Here, put up your hand. No, no, it's the lady there in the middle. Put up your hand. Okay.
My name is Haley Fox. I'm from Gallaudet University in the U.S. And my question is for Elizabeth. And one thing that really left an impression on me from my work experience in Central Africa was, number one, everything you addressed, very true about the challenges and the barriers for persons with disabilities in many developing countries. But something that really impressed me was, as compensation for that, the social and the community support for people that, in a lot of ways, I feel is very absent in the United States, in my experience. And to give a couple examples, I taught at a school for the deaf in Cameroon, and I saw, my neighbor was in a wheelchair, and she was carried to school every day by her classmates because the roads were completely inaccessible for her wheelchair. Or a colleague in Costa Rica who's deaf, and a group of of other students that had some dexterity issues, disabilities, cerebral palsy, etc., learning sign language, which improved the muscles in their hands, so that gave them strength, and they also were able to communicate with their deaf colleagues. I'm thinking about ideas like this. I'm just wondering if you have some examples in relationship perhaps to funding initiatives from national human rights institutions that have sort of bypassed the economic barriers from the government, that are not willing to have interest or investment in funding accessibility, and have used community initiative and social support in those types of projects to really create change.
Thank you. Now we're going to go for some quick answers. Who's first? All to Elizabeth. Not all.
Okay, thank you so much for all those questions. Really, so I'll do my best to answer, and other colleagues from the developing world who can address some of the questions, or please feel free to add on to some of what my thoughts are. So, with regard to the question on DPO capacity and sort of complex calls for proposals, which make it difficult for DPOs to respond to apply for funding, and therefore makes it difficult for DPOs to be able to advocate for change. So I think it's definitely a systemic issue, and I think that I can see a future in which, if we lobby now enough for inclusive education and enough for access to education for people with disabilities in Africa, I can see a future in which people with disabilities will have had equal access to education and will be able to apply for funding then. But in the meantime, right now, I think the issue, I think it's both ways. It's about donor organizations being willing to change a bit some of how they go about funding. So instead of expecting a polished, finalized proposal, how about co-developing the proposal with a group, with the DPO itself? So you call for proposals, and this perhaps is a call to people from development agencies who may be here. So when you call for an application, then be willing to kind of, after you handpick some of the better applications, to work with the DPO through identifying what are inputs, outputs, all that project, project lingo, kind of, work together with them to develop a project that then, like, more hands-on support rather than just, go on, get us a perfect proposal, which might not come from DPOs really. Another idea I would have on that also is collaboration between DPOs and NHRIs. So back to Karen's point, that if DPOs were to make relationships with NHRIs, they might be in a better position, perhaps, to be able to get the capacity, from the NHRIs to apply for such funding for joint projects. So that may also be a possibility for DPOs to do that. So the Center for Human Rights in Pretoria. So this is the Center for Human Rights of Pretoria. For this year's conference, so the center holds a conference on the rights of people with disabilities in Africa annually, supported by the Open Society Foundations. And this year, the focus is people with albinism in Africa. So that will be on between 9th and 10th of November, and we are really looking forward to kind of really coming up with key proposals, coming up with key recommendations, coming up with concrete ways to rope in all the different actors that need to come into this. But also to add that there's a lot happening within Malawi, just in terms of some of the universities there that are part of a project that is implementing disability rights in universities, and you have university students going out into the community to raise awareness about these issues of albinism. So there's some work ongoing, but perhaps not enough given the gravity of the issues that are there. So I just wanted to say that. Yeah, and the community support question. So yes, I agree with you that one of the biggest advantages in Africa is sort of that social cohesion. A slight warning though, more in rural areas than in the massive urban areas where that is disintegrating pretty quickly. I have seen some examples of using sort of that community, that community cohesion to promote the rights of people with disabilities, particularly through DPOs. There's an organization in Kenya of people with intellectual disabilities, and they basically go about creating awareness by just starting from the local shop near the home of the person with an intellectual disability. The local butchery, going there with the person, explaining what an intellectual disability is, explaining, what kinds of the support the person will need when they are sent to the shop. Just really, really basic small things within the community to kind of create inclusivity. So yeah, there are some things happening. I don't know if that was all the questions.
I think so. I think you did really well there. I'm going to go for 2 more questions, right? And it's the front gentleman here in the front and the lady here, second row back or third row back.
Thank you, Chairman. Mine is not a question, but just a comment. Thank you for the presentation. But really, I would like to agree completely with what Elizabeth has presented in case of developing countries. And an example is myself. I'm from a poor family, and I was just a one person with disability, and my parents were very poor. They could not take me to school. It was a challenge to take me to school. But my parents said, okay, for the other siblings, we will not support you. We'll focus all the support to this guy because he can't till the land and have earning out of that. That's why I was able to go to the university. And I did that on the expenses of my siblings. Number of them did not go to school. Now I have a responsibility to really educate my siblings, and I thank God that at least now 2 of them have a degree and 1 has a diploma. I also concur with the situation of DPOs in developing countries, that there is a competition on the scarce resources. And this has led even not to be able to work together because they are competing for resources, and therefore having no even a common agenda to push, our issues, as well as lack of political will of the government really to implement the good policies and legislation. In my country, we have a quota system for employment for people with disabilities, that for any employer who has 20 employees and above, 3% of those should be people with disabilities. But to what extent that is being implemented is a questionable. So I concur with the presentation of Elizabeth, but also the role of Human Rights Commission. In my country, I think we haven't explored a lot to see how we can team up and work together to make even more impact. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. My God, that one is going to be a hard to frame a question out of that, but next, please.
Thank you. My name is Shirley Gawaila from Botswana. I want to agree with Elizabeth first and all the speakers that has been talking. All the examples that we are giving here, everything is happening in Pretoria. We have seen that our country has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, and the most disappointing thing, we don't have a disability policy, nothing at all in place. But government is trying to work on what the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability is saying. Instead of coming up with disability policy, we have a DPO. There's a confusion of how well do we understand or what do we mean by DPO in Botswana. When we talk about mainstreaming of disability programs, we don't know what we mean by that. It's so confusing because most of the time, most people people are saying we fail to understand the technical issue and the main issue that DPO want. So in Botswana, the organization I'm working for, Botswana Federation of Disabled, when we talk about issues of capacity of our members, this is the serious challenge, because when we go out to people, you see that there's a lot of resistance, there's a lot of lack of cooperation. I want to appreciate what people who have powers, like those who are coming from Parliament, are trying to teach us from there. For a long time, since I gave us a call for proposals, we did not know how to go about it, because we did not have any funding. Our government has a lot of money to support people with disability, but as DPO, we don't benefit from government funding. So, because of the proposal and the budget that we are doing now, strengthening disability organization, our parliament is trying to see the picture that we are trying to change Botswana. When we talk about disability policy, the policy is still in parliament, but not ratified or not passed. We asked the parliament why, and we went to the office of president. We have the coordination office for disability at the office of president. The office itself is not effective. The office was set up to enforce implementation and policy. For 10 years now, nothing is being done. So DPO are feeling the pressure and lack of capacity, lack of understanding issues, what we mean by policy. So I want to say that I appreciate the presentation, because it helped me to go back to my country to see how we can bring about the change as a DPO, and also working with women rights organization. Sometimes it's challenging, because most of the organization in Botswana are fragmented. They don't want to work together. Everyone wants to work alone. So it's a challenge, like the way proposal, the budget we are doing with women rights organization. They don't want to work with us. Only when funding has been approved, people want to work with you. But when we start working on the proposal, we all come back, call them, let's try to do this together. They don't want to cooperate. When funding has been approved, everyone wants to come on board. It's very frustrating, because we don't know how to work together.
Can I ask you to stop now for a moment, please? Because if we don't, we're all going to go to lunch, and we won't get a chance to get any comments at all on your. So, okay, but thank you. We did get some of it, and some of it I didn't get, but I'm hoping. Right, who wants to take the first question first? Well, it was more commentary as well on Elizabeth's presentation. Yeah. Huh? Sorry?
I don't have a comment. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so I have a comment. Something has just come to my mind about the community support thing, and I think it's important to raise it. I think sometimes our governments in developing countries take advantage of that social cohesion and refuse to take responsibility in terms of state obligations. And I think this is important, because then what ends up happening is, it's very good when all this support works. But my friend, the day it doesn't work, you're in trouble, because then you don't have it as a matter of right, you have it as a matter of favor. So so just to put that out there and say, okay, so to address then your issue about Botswana, I agree it's very difficult to lobby for change when you haven't ratified the convention in the first place, and when you don't have a policy. That creates a real challenge. But I do know that at least there's the beginning, you are at least beginning work already in terms of trying to create a movement and trying to come together as DPOs to create some kind of change. I think that the answer to a lot of these issues lies in collaboration, lies in how well you are able to come together as a movement to develop an agenda that is common, and and also lies in how well you sort of work together with other actors, other civil society actors, NHRIs, and other such actors. So, but I do agree with you that it's a real challenge when you haven't ratified the convention. And perhaps one of the important things you could get done here is ask about lobbying strategies towards ratification. Sort of really have discussions with people who have participated in lobbying their own countries towards ratification, and really get sort of real strategies that you can use back home to drive the change. I think that will be useful. Yeah.
I think we can leave it at that. And we go over to you, Karen, yeah?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Just 2 points, Chair. One, adding on what Elizabeth said, and then one, going back to our colleague from Malawi, something I just must say. Yeah. In terms of collaboration, it may be useful to consider, that you establish a community, a network of practice here from people who have attended here. I don't know whether that happens normally at the end of these disability summer schools. And people can remain in touch, because I hear what she's saying about the abilities to take forward a movement or to establish a movement, strengthen the movement. I think there's a lot of good practice in the room that could help her with that. So just something to take forward from here itself. And then, Chair, the point made by our colleague on albinism particularly, and he mentioned that something about what the international voices on the issue. But I want to say to you that we now have an independent expert on albinism for the very first time, and there was also the very first regional forum in Africa on albinism that was held last week. And so it will be interesting to see what the outcomes are. It was convened by the independent expert, and so it would be important to see what the outcomes are from that. But I wanted to also share with you that this was hosted by the independent expert together with the government of Tanzania, the Prime Minister's office, the UN country team in Tanzania, the Tanzania Commission on Human Rights and Good Governance, the World Bank, civil society organizations, namely Standing Voice, Under the Same Sun, the embassies of Norway, Ireland, and the USA in Tanzania, and the Canadian High Commission as well. So I just wanted to make the point about a lot of what we've been saying. Something around that was in action, and it happened last week. So you may want to just consult the UN page on that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. That brings us to a close for this morning. We're going to go to lunch. But just before we do that, can I again, on your behalf, thank Marian, Elizabeth, and Karen. I do remember.